In this video, we're going to talk about the relationship between decimals, fractions, and percentages. Essentially, what we want to note here is that we can represent a number as a decimal, in fraction form, or in the form of a percentage. So one of our tried and true examples would be working with, say, 5/10, which we might remember is also the same thing as the fraction 1/2, which we also know is the same thing as the percentage of 50%. Before we dive into how to create that conversion between, say, a fraction to a decimal or a decimal to a percent, let's actually talk about the word percent. Let's break that down. So per, we can kind of refer to this as the phrase out of. And then cent, we can think of as the number 100. So again, if we think of century, that's 100 years. If we think of centipede, that insect allegedly has 100 legs. Even if we talk about cents, if you think about it in terms of pennies, how many pennies do you need for that to equate to $1? We would need 100 pennies or 100 cents. So let's apply this definition to 40%. We can write 40% as a fraction. So kind of think about it as you say it, 40%. In other words, let's translate that. 40 out of 100. So 40 out of 100. So really quickly, we've already converted this into a fraction form. And then, of course, best practice says that we should simplify the fraction down if we are able to. Keep in mind that when you're reducing a fraction, we sometimes might have to do this in a couple steps if we don't see the greatest common factor that we can reduce out. So, for example, say I don't see the greatest common factor here, but I'm going to note right away that I could reduce my fraction by 10. So this will give me 4 out of 10. And now I also see that I could further reduce this by a common factor of 2. And this will give me 2/5. Note that I am using equal signs between each of these numbers. So I am saying that these are saying the same thing. So for example, the idea of 40/100 is the same thing as 2/5. If we look at a picture of this, so what I have here is I have the same size circle, and in one I have 40/100. So imagine that all those slices that you see are evenly sliced. I did have to hand draw that, and unfortunately I know that it's not perfect. But I shaded 40 of those 100 slices. Similarly, I came over to the second circle and broke this up into 5 even slices, and I shaded 2 of them. Notice that I'm covering the same area. This is what I mean by saying that 40/100 is the same thing as 2/5. Before we actually work through some practice problems, let's talk about some tips that you can use when converting between decimals, fractions, and percentages. I would suggest either taking screenshots of the slide that you see before you or pausing the video as you need to in order to jot these notes down. Our first tip is going to be converting a decimal to a fraction. So the first thing that you really want to know when doing this is know your decimal place values. Know how to read a decimal appropriately, because if you are able to read it appropriately, you can immediately convert it into its fraction. As you speak it, you're almost saying what the fraction looks like. So for example, if we start off with, say, 6/10. So listen to as I say that, 6/10. Can you imagine or picture what that fraction looks like in your mind? So hopefully we're thinking 6/10 or 6/10. From here, we could reduce that down to 3/5. Converting from a decimal to a percent, we can use the shortcut of moving the decimal point 2 spaces to the right. Why 2 spaces? Another way of really thinking about this is to view this as a multiplication between the decimal and the value of 100. Again, the 100 isn't arbitrary. Remember what we had talked about with regards to percent. What number comes to mind when we say percent? So say, for example, we have the decimal of 732 thousandths. So again, if we multiply this by 100, we get 73.2%. And again, if we kind of think about this a little bit more, if we just started off with the decimal place and moved it 2 spaces to the right, we would get that result of 73.2%. Next, let's talk about converting a fraction to a decimal and then from there to a percent. So in order to accomplish this, we're going to take our fraction and we are either going to do a division using our calculator or we're going to do it by hand. So for example, let's say that we work with the fraction 1/3, and maybe you know from experience that 1/3 is a non-terminating decimal. In other words, it goes on forever. In this case, we could write that as 1 being divided by 3, or again, if you use your calculator or you just remember from memory, we note that 1/3 or 1 divided by 3 is the same thing as 0.3333, and it just goes on forever. So from here, if we wanted to convert this into a percentage, we can use what we had noted above. What we are going to go ahead and do is we are going to locate the decimal. I'm going to use the shortcut here. Remember, you could also just take that decimal and multiply it by 100. We're doing essentially the same thing. The shortcut is just a shortcut. So we're going to locate that decimal and we're going to move it 2 spaces to the right. So this would reveal a percentage of 33.33333%. And again, that 3 is going on forever. Or what we can do is we can write a bar over that 3 to indicate to yourself and the reader that the 3 is just going to keep repeating indefinitely. And of course, we don't want to forget our percentage sign to indicate that we have created a percentage. Moving along, we're going to convert a fraction to a percent. This is specifically for fractions that have denominators with a 2, a 4, a 5, a 10, 20, 25, and 50 in them. The reason why I'm listing out these numbers is because it's very easy to multiply it by a number to create 100 in the denominator. For example, let's say that we have the fraction 7/20. I want to think about what number can I multiply with 20 in order to create 100. And hopefully we remember that we can multiply that by 5. And again, since I want to maintain the value of that fraction, if I am multiplying the denominator, or the bottom half of the fraction, by 5, I also need to do that to the top part. I need them to grow at the same rate. So this would give me 35 out of 100. And again, using that definition of percent, we have 35 out of 100. We can note that this is 35%. Again, this is only going to work for those fractions with that specific denominator value of 2, 4, 5, 10, 20, 25, 50. If they do not have that specific kind of denominator, then I would encourage you to go back to the solution above, doing a division and then converting that decimal into its percent. We've already kind of talked about how to convert a percent to a fraction, but remember, percent means out of 100, so go ahead and take your percent, rewrite it as a fraction with a denominator of 100, and reduce it down if possible. Lastly, we have converting a percent to a decimal, and we're essentially going to use a very similar shortcut, although instead of moving the decimal point 2 spaces to the right, we move it 2 spaces to the left. For example, say we have 9%. We are going to go ahead and write that 9. If I don't see the decimal point, it means it's hanging out right after the 9. And I'm going to move it to the left 2 spaces. Again, the idea of percent, remember what number is connected to that word. And since in this situation I have an empty space, I'm going to fill that in with a 0. So my final solution here would be 0.09, or read appropriately, that would be 9/100ths. I didn't note it here, but instead of, if you don't want to do the shortcut, essentially what you are doing here is you are taking that percentage and you are dividing by 100. So kind of going back up to the previous bullet point, we would convert it into its fraction form and then take care of the division. Okay, let's go ahead and do some practice. So the goal of our practice problems is to translate the number that we're provided into the other 2 forms. So for example, if we are starting off with 34.2%, we want to write this out in its decimal form and we want to write it out in its fraction form. So to begin, we're going to go ahead and take that 34.2% and we're going to write it as a decimal. So in order to do that, we're going to locate where the decimal place or the decimal point is, and I'm going to use that shortcut, and I'm going to move the decimal to the left 2 spaces. So this is going to give me a decimal value of 342 thousandths. And again, as I say that in that proper quote-unquote math grammar, I'm already kind of saying the fraction. So 342 thousandths becomes 342 over 1,000. From here, we can go ahead and reduce that fraction further. Best practice says simplify your answer if you can. So I'm at least noting here that I can reduce a 2 from the numerator and the denominator. And this ends up giving me 171 over 500. And that's as far as I can go. For our second problem, we have 62 thousandths. So the goal here is to write out the percentage form and the fraction form. It's up to you which one you want to tackle first. I'm going to choose to do the percentage first. So I'm going to use my shortcut. I'm going to locate where that decimal place is, or that decimal point, and this time I'm going to move it to the right 2 spaces. So the decimal form becomes a percentage of 6.2%. Now again, if I go back and talk about how to appropriately say the decimal form, I'm actually also saying the fraction form simultaneously. So before I had said that that was 62 thousandths. So 62 thousandths. And again, I note that I can at least reduce the numerator and denominator by 2, and this gives me 31 500ths. And it looks like I couldn't reduce that down any further, so this is why I'm going to circle it and say this is my final answer. For our third problem, we have 5 halves, and we want to present this both in a decimal form and in a percentage form. So the first thing that I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to fall back on one of the tips that I had shared earlier, and I'm going to rewrite this fraction so that it has a denominator of 100. Notice that I do have a denominator of 2, so I can easily convert this into a denominator of 100. If I were to simply multiply both the numerator and denominator by 50, because again, I want to maintain the value of that fraction, I will rewrite it so that it has a denominator of 100. So this becomes 250 over 100. In other words, this is 250%, or 250 out of 100. Likewise, if I want to convert this into a decimal form, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to bring my 250% over here. I'm just going to double represent it so we can kind of clearly see all of our answers. I'm going to locate the decimal. If I don't see it, then it's just hanging out at the very end, right after 0. And again, I'm going to move it to the left 2 decimal places. So the decimal form will become 2.50, or you could just write 2.5. If your decimal ends in a 0, you can feel free to let it drop off. And here we go. So we have all of our solutions. Now it's time for you to practice. So go ahead and take a moment, read through each of these questions, and again, provide its 2 other missing forms. When you are done, so please pause the video to take care of these, and when you are done, we will go ahead and review those solutions. And here are our solutions. So if we start off with 71.5%, the decimal form will be 0.715, or 715 thousandths. From there, you can go ahead and write out that fraction form and reduce it down, which becomes 143 over 200. For our second question, we have 84 hundredths. So again, we can use our shortcut to convert this into its percentage form. We can move that decimal over to the right 2 times, and that will give us 84%. And again, 84%, or 84 out of 100, will result in our fraction, which we would then reduce down all the way to 21/25. And finally, we have 3/5, and it looks like in this case, if we multiply the numerator and denominator by 20, we can rewrite the fraction so that it has a denominator of 100. This becomes 60/100ths, or 60%. And then again, using our shortcut, we can locate that decimal point, which would be hanging out right after the 0, and move it 2 spaces to the left, which will then give us 0.6 or 0.60, or in other words, we could say 6/10. All right, we are done with this video.